two ways of reporting information in SmartSimple. It's not going to be an exhaustive list, but it is worthwhile understanding which one is more suitable for which task. So you may have heard the terms list view, you may have heard reporting, and oftentimes it's difficult to know what to pick. So that's what we're going to do here. So the problem is, generally, I suppose both of them have so many options in different ways, and knowing what one can do can really influence how you choose to make that information work. So what we can do is provide a series of questions you can ask yourself prior to building, and an awareness of your requirements and where you can retrieve them. So with that in mind, let's say that you're new to SmartSimple, or someone else is, or someone has a particular requirement. Let's say something along the lines of, I want all of the details of the applications that are sent in, any activities around them, and I want a specific amount of detail. What would work best for that? Well, you would need a little bit more information than that to get a sense of what would be required, but I have some of the criteria here. So with a list view, you have up to 30 individual columns, and you can include multiple values per column. You can format them on the screen. So color, alignment, bolding, line breaks, text, that kind of thing. They're dynamic, they're updated in real time. They can be converted to aggregates or shortcuts or even charts on the portal. I'll briefly show how that can look. You can have multiple filters assigned to it, and you can also have a map panel. And in general, I found that from a user-friendly perspective, it's less technical. You don't need to know any kind of anything about SQL, visibility conditions, things like that. Not that they're difficult to learn, but if you're doing something in a hurry, I would generally gravitate towards a list view. So I would generally say that a lot of your reporting needs would be covered by a list view. It does a lot, but of course there are areas where it does fall short, and that's where we would bring in a report. So reports in SmartSimple are data mining deep reports, very powerful. You can have up to 100 individual columns. You cannot combine values in a third column as such. It would be more calculations. You can include data sets from multiple sources. So what I mean by that is, let's say that you wanted grant details and also maybe budget details or perhaps program details from the year that it occurred. They're dynamic, they're updated in real time, and they can also be exported either ad hoc or on a scheduled basis, which can be very helpful for your audit team, particularly if they asked for a snapshot of the data as of X date. You could have that export to them automatically, quite helpful. You can represent these as charts. They aren't as dynamic in portals as list views are, so that's worth knowing. There are capabilities like using OData and pivot tables as well. So for anyone who's not familiar with OData, we do have quite a bit of information on it. It's essentially an external data source connection that you can provide to an Excel document. That way, if, for example, you have someone who maybe not in the system all the time, they simply need the data, you could provide them with an updated data set from there. It also allows for formulae, complex aggregation, as well as filters. So with that in mind, you can actually perform calculations in a report in a way that you cannot in a list view. A list view allows for a total, and that's pretty much it. Also, reports can be internet enabled. So that way you can provide this information elsewhere. Using OData, you can also include the data from this on, say, a HTML page on your home website. So that's one option. So what does that look like in practice? Well, for this, we're going to go to a demo, and I'm just going to tab between my screens.
Sharon, just before the demo, Eric actually did a webinar on OData earlier today, and that will be uploaded to our YouTube channel later this week. So if anybody is interested in learning more about OData, you can check out our YouTube page.
Perfect. Thanks, Sarah. Good timing. Okay. So this was something that may be familiar to anyone who's worked with this. So the good news about list views and filters is that they operate the exact same no matter where you are. So they're the kind of searches that you would run on any application, regardless of what it's called. They will all behave the same way. So with a list view, you can see here that we've got a few things here, but I want to change this. So let's say that I wanted to have some basic data. Maybe I want to change things around. Maybe I want to add a few more features. So I could build a list view from scratch, but realistically, I don't have infinite time. Nobody does. Everyone has other stuff to do. So what we would generally recommend is, for testing while you're going through this for the early times, if you're not entirely sure of what happens when you do X, strongly urge you to log into the backup environment first. So it will always have BK at the end of your URL prior to the .com. Your name and credentials will work the exact same. That way here, this is a sandbox instance as such. It basically means that whatever you do here will be overwritten by the live instance the next day. So it means that you can really use it as a sort of falling environment, to use a climbing term. What I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to look at this default option here. So this is actually a list of all of the different list views. You can make them all available in this list. You can use them on applicant portals, external users, etc. And I can see that the one that's active has a check default. Great. So I can take this wrench, which will open up a new screen for me. And then I will be able to make a copy of it. So with all of this, I am pretty shameless in terms of copying as much as you can, building on that, just because it can often be a lot easier to work with, but I'll go copy from here. And you may see as system list view, as personal list view. And it will give you all of the settings you previously had with copy in parentheses. So what I'm going to do here, and these are generally practices that I have found work best over time, I'm going to rename it. So first thing I'm going to call it is demo training. Just because that way, even if I was accidentally working on the live instance, I would know when I look at this view that it's maybe not something that needs to be there or is in use by anybody else. Another way I would name things is start by who needs to see it. So staff, new export data. For example, display order indicates where it's going to display on that list, no big deal. Role permission indicates who can see it. So only those listed can see it. Otherwise, if you leave it blank, it allows everybody. Filter option, you can actually start by typing any filter that's been built. And what's good now is you can also start to stack multiple filters on top of each other. So you're not obligated to build these giant complex filters each time. You can start to kind of stack them together. So for example, all of this type for the current year and in this status or something like that. Description, even if you're on backup, I think it's fantastic practice to always put something in. So I'm going to put in here demo purposes, just something enough that if someone glanced at it, they would know what it was about. I can change my view styles around if I want to. I can manifest it as a tab. You can, but it can also take up screen real estate, so just a heads up there. If you click it to open in edit mode, that's perfect. You don't have to toggle between view and edit. Row clickable, that means when you click a row, it opens. You do not need an open button. Enable file download means I can download any file from the main application or any activities connected to it. If I didn't want this to show up in a list, I could say marked as configuration only. And what I often do to enable a map panel, which I'm going to go and show you as well, is while they're great, I find that they're very helpful for display purposes primarily. So if you were building a list view that you wanted to display as perhaps part of a presentation, I would usually copy that list view, enable a map panel on that one, and then work with that. Open behavior, you can define whether it opens in a main window, modal window, or main and multi options. I can include translated data language if that's relevant, if anyone's working with multiple languages. And then from here, I can save this. I usually find it's good practice to save going from tab to tab, partially because I find when doing these kind of builds, it can be quite easy to get called away for whatever reason. And if you got timed out, it would not have auto-saved. So I'm a stickler for saving and I would recommend it. And then columns here. Once I open this up, I can see that I have my different columns. And what's nice about this is depending on where you are in the system, you can retrieve data from different sources. So because we're on the grant level, in this case of a submission or anything like that, I can see I can pull any field in here from the grant. Great. I can also down here click the organization fields, add any field from the organization connected to that application. if there's a staff member connected to it, I can pull their details too. If there's an applicant connected, which there usually is, I can pull the details from here as well. And if I wanted to include internal branch details, I could do so. What's nice about these as well is that at the top we have a search bar. So if you're not sure entirely what you're looking for, but maybe amount, you want to include those, you can do so. So right now you can see that there are 10 columns, that's well and good, and you can go up to 30. However, if, for example, you wanted to include an 11th column, you will get a little warning to say, for an optimal user experience, create these between 4 and 10 columns wide. The reason for that is, essentially, if you wanted to have a list view that you were just going to view on the screen on a regular basis, 4 to 10 columns is optimal, because then you don't have to scroll side to side. However, if you were planning something for export and it was up to 30 columns, this is fine. It's not going to cause any major issues. It's just something that I would flag as being exportable. So I can throw that in. I've got my requested amount, my awarded amount. Maybe I want some other details as well, or maybe I want to have this in such a way that my organization address is a block. So what I'm going to do with this is I'm actually going to maybe change around a couple things. I don't need to see the grant staff, and I don't need the modified by right now, but I do need the organization address. So I can see here when I click into any one of these cells that I have my header caption, which I can update. I could add multiple record values to this. As you can see, once I click into a cell, I get these extra arrows, insert to current column. If they're pointing to the right, they're possible to insert. If they're pointing to the left, as you can see here, I can remove them. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go down to organization fields, and I'm going to play around with it a little bit. So I'm going to add this as a new column, click the plus, and I'm going to start with address. Great, so address isn't going to help me right now, so I'm going to say organization address. So maybe this has mailing capability, for example. So with the content template, I can also include the city, the state, the country, the zip. Let's say for argument's sake that this is also going to be something that is turned into labels. Who knows? To make sure that that looks okay, I'm going to put a space and a line break between all of these. Quick note for anyone on these, the values you have must be selected from the list using these options. There are some processes going on underneath the surface, so typing these out won't necessarily render the values as you intend. And second, while unfortunately there isn't, it's not security recommended to include HTML actually in the content template. That being said, you can use text alignment, left, right, center, font color, let's pick something subtle, and you can bold the text, hide a column. So we would use that, for example, if you wanted to have something that you could search without necessarily displaying that information on the page, or if you were using it for sorting. You can show a total, so I'll do that on awarded amount, and I'll bold it, and I can do that on requested amount as well. So far so good, and I'll save before moving on by any column that you've included. As well as that, you can sort ascending or descending. The default will always be last modified in descending order. So never have to worry about that. And there are ways to sort on the actual page without going into the settings as well. So definitely worth knowing about. And with these, you can see that there's quite a lot you can pull into them, given that you can pull in any field from the grant itself or wherever you happen to be. One thing I will point out, you will only see the fields that are visible to you by your permissions anywhere in this. So there wouldn't be a case where you would be able to put in fields that you yourself would not have access to. Okay, so this is having a little bit of a moment. So I'm going to just see if I can refresh my page and see what happens. In this case, let's look at what we've got so far. So we can now see there's our staff export data. We can go in and keep editing it because there's a couple more things we can do. If it decides to, it wants to, yes, it does. Okay, excellent. All right, so sort order. You can sort by any record. So what I would usually do would be something like awarded amount, descending order. I want to see who got the most and where it's going. Export. All you need to make sure that a list view is exportable to Excel is this enable export toggle at the top. There's really nothing else you need to do. It will take all of the data, strip all formatting out, and pop it into a blank Excel document. So I definitely recommend having that there just as an easy thing. A lot of the options you'll see here, like update status, trigger workflow, etc., they tend not to get used. And I would recommend only using them if there was quite clear documentation around them so that other people were aware that that would happen. But it's absolutely available. You can also update things like the data positions, search criteria positions, anything like that. Quick Edit allows you to edit any of the columns in that. I avoid it in favor of a newer feature that I think is better. So I'll go through that. And then finally, batch update buttons. This allows you to take one action and basically apply that action to multiple records at the same time. So very, very useful for things like awarding everybody at the same time. But I think in the interest of time, I'm going to avoid that for the time being. This is more of a comparison between filters and list views. So I'm going to just save this and review it. And incidentally, if anyone is curious as to all the detail we're looking at today, everything is on our wiki. So if you can see list view overview at the top here, I can provide this in the chat box as well, so that anyone who wants to read up on this or has any fascination with this, they absolutely can. So right now we can see that the initial list view that we have, it doesn't look like this. So we're still on the default. So anything you do will be there until you actively change it. So here, for example, I can see staff export data. I can see now there's my very subtle color scheme. You can see my requested versus awarded amounts. Goodness, that person really oversold it, I think. And I can see as well that I've got my awarded amount in highest to lowest, or lowest to highest, I think, actually. I can also drag and drop these columns. So if I wanted this to be further along, I can do so. Just drag and drop it around. It allows me to save those column widths. From here as well, I can select all my records, batch update them, export them, download my files, add to a smart card, delete, or group email. Group email is a feature you can enable. So if anyone hasn't come up against it before now, happy to mention it. But what's nice about list views is that, yeah, I could click a record and it would open the record. That's nice, and I get to view one thing. But let's say that in this case, I actually wanted to review multiple records in one go. So this is one reason why I would avoid quick edit in favor of this feature up at the top, which is split screen. So we can see now that, as the name implies, split screen has the records on one side. I can click through each one, review the details I need to review, and move them forward. Then once I want to put this back to the regular, I can disable it up here, pops it back to where it was. So that's pretty neat. I can also sort by clicking column headers, question amount, twice. I can also reload my data. So if anyone is unsure as to how to reload data that on a page that you're on without going back to your home page, on a list, you'll see this little reload icon, or if you right click and select reload frame, that will reload exactly where you are. Just a tip. And list view options here is something I find very useful and worth noting. So what this is, it allows you to dictate the style of the view you use, and it also allows you to define which columns are visible to you. So for example, let's say you built this for your team and maybe one or two don't need certain columns. Like for example, organization address, maybe not everybody needs that. So you can uncheck that, won't see it. And once you save it, when it reloads, that very subtle coloring, you may notice it gone. So that's good to know. I'll just pop back to corporate giving here. And now we can see it's gone. Okay. So with that, that means that you can build, for example, a master list view with all of the requirements individuals have. Then you can direct them to this and allow people to dictate what would be visible. You can also show these as a grid or a tree. So depending on what makes most sense for you. So a grid looks like this, kind of a business card layout. Just going to, in the interest of time. So we can see here, that's what a grid layout can be. Or if I want to look at a tree layout, this is one I find helpful, particularly for things like organizations. So you can have a sense of how many records are in any one thing. So we can see here that the grant is seen here. We've got any attachments, any other activities, they'd be listed here too. It's kind of nice. So I'll put it back to list. And then on the global side, you can show whether you use smart cards, and also you can define how many records per page. Quick note to anyone who's on this call, sometimes I find keeping it to 20 to 40 really most of the time that's going to really speed up your loading time. So at 100, it can take longer. So that's one reason that a slow loading time can occur. So I just wanted to highlight that. And you can also update that by clicking over here. And if you wanted to view everything, you can. So that's well and good. Our batch update allows you to take multiple actions on multiple records at the same time. The export here allows me to export this data to a blank Excel document. I'll open that and show you what it looks like now. That can be quite useful because then, for example, if you wanted to export that data into one sheet on an Excel document, as you can see here, you could theoretically take a second sheet, pivot off that data, that kind of thing. So that's good to know. You can put filters on list views, very helpful. You can also download all the files. So if you select nothing, the system will say, did you mean everything? And I'll say yes, because we're on backup. So what that will do is it will look at the grant and the activity, and you can download anything that has been uploaded as an attachment to that record. So for example, maybe you want all the submitted PDFs in one go, or perhaps maybe some forms that individuals need to fill out. This is where you can do so. And once you click download, they'll download in the background, you'll see a notification in the header. So that's really good because then it doesn't crash anything as you're going. And the useful thing here is that you can see that you can build these on any level. So grants, activities, disbursements in this case. But what's useful to note is that on these, you can pull information from different sources depending on where you are. So for example, on the grant, we saw that you could pull information from the organization, the applicant connected to it, and so on. Whereas when we get to activities, for example, and we look at our common fields here, you can see that we have the option to select from fields in the activity or fields in the grant. But those are the only two options available. So that's one limitation of list views, in that there are certain limited sets of data that you can access from that point, which is where really reporting comes in. So with those criteria in mind that we saw before, let's take a very brief look at what reports look like, how we can manage them, some best practices for how you build them. So before I get into reports, I would generally say that it's worth having an idea of how many records you should reasonably expect. So I usually work in tandem with list views and reports. I usually find that that can inform my process a little easier. It means that my checks are much more easy to verify. Reports are visible under tools here. So if anyone on the call has worked with any kind of reporting software before, so Crystal reports, Tableau, Access, anything like that, this will make total sense. If you haven't, it will still make sense, just a little longer. So I'm going to build one from scratch. And these reports are only accessible to system administrators. You can make reports available to individuals if they need to see the data, but usually these are more for internal use. So if I click the plus, allows me to create a new report. It's going to have a bit of a different layout to list views as we've seen before. In this case, I'm not going to copy it because it can get quite complex and it's worthwhile showing what it looks like. So this one I'm going to call it webinar. And I'm sorry, there's some kind of truck rally going on outside my building. Okay, so demo, I'm going to categorize it as demo. The better your categories, the better your descriptions, the easier it will be to find, and the easier it will be to remember what it's supposed to do. So once I save that, it provides an ID. I can always provide that if I'm looking for assistance. You can see who made it, when they did it, and you can also associate these with a UTA. So for example, if I wanted to associate one of these with corporate giving, I could do so if I needed to display that information somewhere there. A lot of the time it doesn't happen. Oh, there's my little file available for download. Neat. So from here, what I need to do to build this report is a little different. So it goes back one step in that I have to actually select my data sets first. So the 4 squares up here is always going to be a report builder. And we can already see that this is looking a little different to what we've seen on list views. So fair enough. And just before we dig into it, I just wanted to mention the order of operations that works best for report builder in my experience. So first, getting your data sets in, get some basic info, make sure that you're getting the right numbers, add your data sets as needed, then start to filter down using criteria, and then you can start to use formulae. Then you can finally finish off with grouping, aggregation, that kind of thing. So we're not going to go into it in too much detail, but I just want to show how that can operate and how that works. So if I click plus, whatever my first data set is, it's going to be my primary data set. It's useful to note in here that there are more options for searching here, including things like audit logs, session logs. So that means things like if you want to find out how long individuals are spending in the system, you can do so. I'm going to pick something fairly straightforward. I'm going to go grants, primary data set. I can then add a second one, activities. So a lot of the time, this may be something that happens. If I pick activities, it says, okay, where am I linking this to? So you would link it to the one which has the most connected data, and this is coincidentally the only other one we have. The link field, this is often something that can become a little confusing. So if they're within the same tracking application, so for example, grants and activities, so far so good, what you would be looking at would be base link. However, you can see here calls, reviews, funds. That's something that we would deal with in terms of connect UTAs together. So for example, connecting a program manager to submission manager so that it's tracked correctly, there may be links and we would usually name them something like calls, reviews, or funds. In this case, it's base link. If anyone in outer join, in SmartSimple's terminology, it's slightly different. You can show data with matching link only, which would correspond to an inner join, or show all data from parent data set, including empty links. That would be an outer. All right, so I'm going to go back to my report. Okay, so everyone can see my screen. Thanks for your patience with these delightful technical issues. Report Builder, as we can see, I needed to save that, so I'm just going to do that quickly again. Actually works because my voice was cutting out. So primary dataset, grants. Secondary dataset, connecting my activities in this case to the grants. And the link field I'm looking for, because they're within the same UTA, I would look at base link. If it was a separate UTA, I might look at external links in that sense. That usually is context dependent. And in this case, I'm going to show data with matching links only. So that would be the intersecting data in a Venn diagram. The main reason you would have show all data from parent data set would be in the case that you're running checks on data integrity. So any orphan links, anything like that. So I'll save that. And now let's pull in some fields. So as you can see here, this looks a lot different to list views. But one thing I wanted to highlight was that Report Builder help is really helpful to start off with. So it tells you all of the different elements on the page, what they do. It gives you examples of comparison operators, so it gives you all of the functions that currently work. Incidentally, if you work with MySQL, anything on the mysql.com website is going to work. So you can see all of the different in, not in, etc. Wildcard and like operators, so if you're looking for kind of like matches, anything SmartSimple special criteria. So for example, if you needed to query a database, you can. Date calculations, so for example, looking at current year, etc. And finally, you can run mathematical expressions on more than one column. How that works is you identify the column by the column number. So just something to know for anyone who's moving them around, you may need to update formulae as well. So that can get quite complex. You can have mathematical functions like add, ceiling, floor, mod, string functions, so concatenating details. You can also include logical statements. So if, case when, that kind of thing, all of those are possible. So let's drag some fields in and see what we get. So if I click this grants dataset, I can see all of my fields. It will list them by field name rather than caption. If I go standard fields, those are usually the initial identifiers. So I'll just pull those in, type, maybe status, caption, and maybe I'll just type amount and put it into all fields. So once I start typing here, I can see awarded, okay. And if I wanted to increase my column number, put it up to 6, I might even put in the requested amount. And if I wanted to get really cheeky, I could have a calculation here that says, for example, 4 minus 5. So 4 minus 5. So I'm just going to give it a new column heading to say difference. I can have a total on any of these, incidentally, or I can go with grouping. So I'm going to save that and have a look, preview it. Okay, so cool. You can see a lot of these have some differences, some don't. That's a very basic calculation you could run. And you can always scale this up. So in general, with reports, I would usually suggest buffering a lot of time to go into these. I don't want to go into this in full detail, but they can provide a lot of insight. Under advanced, you'll see things like making it internet enabled, enabling OData connectors. If you have both enabled, you can create 3 public and 3 private access links, as you can see here. You can enable a pivot view, straight join if necessary. You can enable field caching, so if this is visible, say, on a web page, you can cache that. Permissions, who can see it, who can edit it. I would also say if you have a long-standing report and you make changes to it, it is worth documenting that under notes, because that way there's no confusion. But if you're curious about the update history, it's always on the top left. Export here, you can have it exported in various formats as needed. You can export to a folder. You can export a specific value to a field with a custom export. You can also set up a scheduled export on a specific frequency, starting at a certain point, and you can export it either to a folder, so a smart folder internally, or if you use SFTP, Secure File Protocol Transfer, or Transfer Protocol, pardon me, you can build that integration key and work that as well. So you can send email notifications when these are finished, when they fail. So there's all the audit records there you might need. And you can also see the history of that. So from that perspective, reports can be quite good if you're looking at doing kind of larger audit type requirements. But as you can also see, there's quite a lot available in list views as well. I would also say that list views generally are so frequently used that they also tend to get a lot of new updates, and they generally are much more user-friendly. So particularly if you wanted to include filter criteria, here what I would have to do is actually type it in here. So what I would do here is, for example, greater than 0 as an option, and save that and see if that worked. Generally, as a rule, I would recommend doing one action and then previewing it and then checking before going back on to the next thing, just because I often find it can be quite easy to go down a rabbit hole. So now we can see this is where we had all the differences. Cool. You can make a bunch of changes and then it may not work. So to show you what happens, because this can be a little bit sensitive, if I put in here equals X, something very basic, build that report. When I go to reload this, preview, I'll see no matching records. So that's one reason why I recommend going slowly, step by step, having a plan. That will always save you a lot of time. It's kind of going slow to go fast. Okay, so thank you for all listening and your patience with all of these technical issues, but I'm happy to take questions now if anyone has any.
Great, thanks Sharon, that was awesome. So we do have a couple questions. This is from list views. Is there a list of formulae on the wiki?
The formulae are not possible in the wiki itself, but in reporting, yes.
Next question. So one of our users has the permission set so that only system administrators can edit system list views.
Yep.
However, they would like others to be able to copy a system list view as a personal list view and make any changes they would like. Right now, when I emulate other users and try this, it does not have a copy as personal option for other users. It goes straight to a blank new personal list view. Can you show me what setting permission I need to change to allow this?
Great question, and I think that would be a fantastic enhancement. Unfortunately, when it comes to personal list views, that is platform functionality. Okay. So, yeah. But I do think that would be an enhancement. So, I mean, I always find suggestions from clients go a lot further. So if you felt like sending that in, that would be fantastic.
Does the download feature work on L2?
It does, yes. So if I was to have that on, I'll go back to a list view and pick an activity one. Let's put in something here. So again, backup. But if all I want to do is just have enable file download, save it. Once I come out of here, I can see now there's my download files. Once I select that, it just gives me those for the activity. So if you wanted both, you'd need to do it on the grant. But yeah. Oh, and that reminds me, I meant to mention a map. So usually it's easier just to take one that already exists, copy it with one difference, which is on the first tab under Properties, Enable Map Panel. And you can see the object used for distance in this case is organization. If you want to use a different address, you absolutely can, but it can be really useful for seeing the distribution of grants. So if we look at this, and obviously this is all dummy data, but it is useful to see. You can search it down within a certain amount of distance. You can use the current location. You can filter it as well. You can also just scroll right out and see where all of these are. We distributed them kind of a little bit widely, but it really does help, especially if you're focusing on really making sure you're addressing all areas that you might serve. So that I find helpful. As you can tell, searching it is a little bit less user-friendly, so that's why I tend to mention copying it as something else first.
Does the order matter when adding data sets?
Yes, good question. Yes, the order does matter. The order of the primary one does. After that, it doesn't really. So there is an order of operations in reports, which is worth noting, which is that it will always move in priority from left to right. So it always views all of the data in one long statement. So usually that's one thing to keep in mind when structuring. If a particular action or behavior or criteria needs to take precedence, it should probably go further to the left than the right.
Any best practices of having a larger list view and just displaying fewer columns versus having more lists?
Good question. I would definitely say that if you have particular ones that, larger list view, you would have your own visible columns. I would say that it wouldn't be possible to save different visibilities on the same list view right now. With that, I would say having a couple of different list views that maybe you could set to your specifications. So for example, I would usually find that if it was different enough, like more than say you're changing 3 columns on a regular basis, you might as well make a copy of it and then just take those fields out.
Is there a way to insert columns in between other columns in Report Builder?
Good question. So not exactly, but what's nice about both reports and list views is that when you go in here into your builder, you can simply drag and drop them around. So there it is. And also when I click these 3 dots at the top, I can go left, right, or delete. You can also choose whether any of these would display or not. And there's also some really useful grouping and aggregate functions. So what I tend to do with this as an example would be a total group by the awarded amount per organization for that year. Obviously, this is not the focus of today's session, but that would be something I would look at in reports rather than list views, if that's how I wanted to present it.
Awesome. Can you link applications to sub-activities in reports?
Yes, you can. So if I was to do that, you can either link it as having all 3 layers, but you can also simply, so for example, if I just got rid of this data set too for now, or in fact edited it, so I can see activities, I want it to become disbursements, in this case, which is a sub-activity. I want it to go to grants. There is no link field at that point. So you would need to actually have both activities and disbursements. So if I go here, grants, link field, base link, matching links only, nice. And now what I would need to do here is go back again, add a third for my sub-activity. In this case, I'm looking at activities because that's the connecting point. Base link is here, and I'm looking at matching links only. So that would be how I would put that together. Good question.
Hey, Sharon. Unless anybody has any other questions, I think that is it so far. So thank you everyone for giving us your questions and for joining us today. If anyone does have any follow-up questions after the webinar, feel free to reach us at businesssolutions@smartsimple.com, and we're happy to talk further about the information today.
Yep. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you for your patience with the technical issues. I hope the rest of your day goes much, much smoother.
Thanks everyone for joining. Have a great day.
Yep, have a good one. Bye.